Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for coming this evening and for staying. And thank you as well to CAIR-NY for inviting me to come here and speak. As somebody who works on civil liberties, I am truly grateful for CAIR's steadfast and relentless defense of core constitutional liberties, which is work that benefits not only American Muslims, but all Americans. And I think what I find most impressive about CAIR's work is that it has endured and even strengthened in the face of some of the most vicious slanders and sustained demonization campaigns from some very powerful precincts, including at times efforts of persecution from its own government. And despite all of that, or really because of it, CAIR is stronger than ever and its work is more profoundly important than ever before. So I'm truly appreciative of any opportunity to come and support this organization in any way that I can. So beyond the work that CAIR does for everybody's rights, the group also has some particular value for me personally and for the work that I do. And the reason I say that is that sometimes when you talk about things like upholding the Constitution, or you write about civil liberties, or you talk about the infringement of core constitutional rights, there's a danger that these things can become abstractions, that we can think about them in a very theoretical and clinical sense. They just become concepts. And one of the things that working with CAIR has enabled me to do that's been incredibly important for the work that I do is that it has enabled me to interact with many of the human beings whose lives are affected and harmed and sometimes even destroyed by the assaults on these liberties and these erosions of rights, and it's been incredibly significant in terms of emboldening the work that I do. And I just want to share with you one specific anecdote that really illuminates how that works for me. In late October of last year, I was contacted by several CAIR lawyers with whom I had worked previously on other issues, and they emailed me and said, we're currently representing an American Muslim whose rights are being violated in a particularly dramatic and egregious fashion, and we really hope that you would be interested in this case and would be willing to write about it and try and bring attention to it. He lives in Qatar, and we can arrange for you to speak to him. And as it turned out, by pure coincidence, I didn't know this, I was scheduled to leave for Doha within 2 or 3 days after they first contacted me. I was doing election coverage for Al Jazeera, and so they arranged for me to meet with this person when I went to Qatar, and I met with him, and his name was Sadiq Long. And Sadiq is an African-American who converted to Islam in the late 1990s, and he had served in the United States Air Force for over a decade. And he spent the last 10 years living in various Muslim countries, including Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, and now in Qatar. And in the middle of last year, he received a telephone call from his family who lives in Oklahoma, which is where he was born and where he was raised. And they called him with some very bad news. They told Sadiq that his mother had become quite ill and had an illness that was almost certain to be terminal. And that her one wish, her really overriding wish, was to see her son Sadiq, whom she hadn't seen in more than 10 years since he had last been able to visit the United States. And so as soon as he heard this, he understood this was his obligation. He saved as much money as he could. He arranged very difficultly to be able to get away from work. And he bought a ticket to fly from Doha to Oklahoma, where his mother was. And he went to the airport on the day that he was scheduled to leave, and he got there and was told, we're sorry, but we're unable to let you board the flight. And he said, why is that? And he was told that the United States government had put him on a list that barred him from flying into or out of the United States. And he was truly bewildered. This is somebody who has never been charged with any crime, never had the slightest indication from any of the governments of the countries in which he lived that he was suspected of wrongdoing of any kind, had never been told by the United States government that he had done anything wrong in it. He was humiliated at the airport by being told that he was barred from boarding this plane. And he spent months trying to figure out why it was that he was barred, how he could rectify what he assumed had been a mistake on the part of the US government, and he got nowhere. And out of desperation, he finally contacted CAIR, and CAIR put him in touch with me. And I wrote about his plight several days after I got back from Qatar. And it's really interesting. One of the things that's interesting about the national security state and homeland security officials is they're a bit like cockroaches. You know how cockroaches love the dark, and the minute you turn on the light, they scamper and they go and hide? As soon as I was able to write about that article and what was happening to Sadiq, after months of his futility, it generated some media attention, some attention was paid, and a week later, he went to the airport and was able to board the plane and fly to Oklahoma and visit his mother. But unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. He spent 6 weeks visiting his mother. He flew, obviously, to the United States without incident. When it was time for him to fly back to Qatar to be with his wife and his children who were still in Doha and to return to his job, he went back to the airport in Oklahoma City and was told that he had been put back onto the no-fly list by unknown officials and would be barred from now flying home after being barred from his own country. And after spending weeks trying to get him off the no-fly list, he finally ended up deciding that the only way for him to get home would be to take buses and trains through Central and Latin America, finally fly from Argentina through a whole bunch of different countries, and it took him 6 days and thousands of dollars to finally get back home. And what was so striking to me about that story, the reason why I'm telling you about it and the reason why it had such an impact on me was not because of the injustice of how his rights had been infringed. Imagine being an American citizen who served your country in the military, who then was told that you were barred from re-entering your own country without any due process, no charge of any kind, not even being able to find out who ordered this. Those kind of injustices are familiar. There's much worse ones that we've all heard about. What really struck me about it was how it affected him. Because when I met with him in Doha, we spoke for several hours, and he told me that when it first happened, he went through these stages of first bewilderment, and then for a long time, a sense of hopelessness, of powerlessness, of impotence. He had no idea what he could do to rectify this. And then he became consumed with anger. But by the time I had met him, and after he had gone to CAIR and realized that there was an organization there to help him, he had gotten rid of his hopelessness and his anger and his sense of despair, and he became very emboldened. He had realized that as an American citizen, he had the right to claim and to demand the rights that had been guaranteed to him. He had become extremely educated about the constitutional issues that were at play, about what options were available to him. He had become an activist. And this is something that I've seen over and over and over again, where discrimination and bigotry and the oppression of American Muslims is converted into something positive. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. And it's important, I know, in my work, that what emboldens and incentivizes me is not just the anger over these injustices, though that's really important to experience and to confront and ingest that anger over what's happening, but also the inspiration that comes from watching people band together and find ways to combat the injustices. Both of those perspectives, not just the anger over the injustice, but the realization that it can be effectively combated, is important for me personally, and I think generally for the cause of upholding the Constitution. So I just want to talk a little bit about what has led me to this event, because I think it's a little bit interesting. The date for this event was chosen quite some time ago. I don't know exactly when, but I know that CAIR of New York contacted me many months ago and asked me to come and speak. And as it turns out, I think it was incredibly well timed. I think it's the perfect time to gather and talk about these issues and the reason why it's so important to support the work that CAIR does. And the reason I think that's true is because of the events of the last week and the tragedy that took place in Boston. And I actually debated with myself a little bit before I came to speak tonight about whether I really wanted to spend any time talking about what happened over the last week in Boston, because it's a very somber and raw event still, and it's a little bit uncomfortable to discuss. But what I really ultimately realized is that it really shouldn't be ignored. And the reason it's important not to ignore it is because it's very instructive about some extremely important lessons to keep in mind as we leave here tonight about what the state of civil liberties is in the United States, what the challenges are that all of us still face. And the reason I think it's so important is because there is a tendency, I think, to believe that the more distant we get from the event that precipitated lots of anti-Muslim animus in the United States and the erosion of rights in the name of the war on terror, which is the attack on 9/11. The further we get away from that event, the more these threats dissipate and the more remote and the less threatening they become. It's very tempting to believe that that's true. But it really isn't true. And the reason it's not true is because the way that governments abuse power, people exercise power, is they never voluntarily relinquish it. Once they are able to acquire more power and to abuse rights, they will continue to do it for as long as they can until they're stopped. They never voluntarily stop on their own. And I think that the events of the last week should be a really stark reminder of how imminent and profound these challenges are, even though we sometimes want to tell ourselves that things have improved in a significant way. And I just want to talk a little bit about what happened the last week and what I think it underscores. So the first thing that I thought was so significant was that in the 48 hours after the attack in Boston, before anyone had any sense at all of who the perpetrators were, there was this immediate narrative that arose in American media discourse, all but decreeing that the attackers must be Muslim. And the way that this was accomplished in particular was that there was a 20-year-old Saudi national who was among the 170 people victimized by the attack. He was one of the people who was injured when the bomb detonated, and he did what everybody else did when the bomb detonated, which is he ran away from the explosion. And he had clothes that were covered with explosives, and he was yelling and screaming like lots of people in distress were. But because he was Saudi, that behavior in which everybody else was engaging led people to become suspicious of him, to tackle him to the ground, and then alert police about his presence. And the American media immediately seized on this and told the country for 48 hours that the suspect of the attack was this 20-year-old Saudi national who was actually a victim. And of course, this was led by the New York Post, Fox News, and then other media outlets followed suit. And even independent of that, there was a more general assumption, almost an eagerness to believe that the perpetrators were Muslim. And the reason why that was so significant is because over and over, this is what happens, even though they are proven wrong again and again. So I'm sure all of you remember the horrific attack in Norway in 2011, in which a summer camp of children was attacked and dozens of them were murdered in cold blood. For the entire day that that attack happened, the New York Times screaming headline announced that the responsibility for this attack was a group of what it called Islamic extremists. It caused media outlets around the world to report this as well. As it turned out, the perpetrator of that attack was not somebody inspired by Islam, but rather motivated by a toxic hatred for Muslims. And the same thing happened in 1995, which is when the second worst terrorist attack on US soil occurred in Oklahoma City. I went back and looked at that media coverage this week because of what I was writing about, and it is astonishing that for 72 straight hours, the American media assured the country over and over and over again without a shred of evidence that the attack on the Oklahoma City courthouse had all the hallmarks of an Islamic attack, and that certainly Muslims were behind it. And it's remarkable how again and again this assumption is embraced only for us to find out that it's false, and yet it never deters that behavior. I think the reason for that is that media outlets and the American citizenry are almost acculturated at this point, trained to associate this sort of violence with Islam and their fellow citizens who are Muslim, notwithstanding the fact that the vast majority of deaths from violent crime and other forms of violence come from people who aren't Muslim. And I think this week should be a reminder of just how prominent that training, that acculturation still is. The second thing that I found really instructive about this week and something to really think about is there was a whole bunch of articles that I encountered, many written by Muslims, but many written by people who weren't Muslim. And it described how almost immediately upon news of the attack, Muslims, not just in the United States, but all over the world, were living in a state of dread and fear over the possibility that the perpetrators would turn out to be Muslim. They were hoping and praying that it would be somebody else. And the reason I find that so significant is because there was no other group that was thinking that way. Right-wing groups in the United States or Christian factions within America weren't petrified that the perpetrators of that attack would turn out to be one of them, even though members of their group have perpetrated far more violent acts on American soil than Muslims. And now that we know who the perpetrators are, white Americans aren't walking around scared that the identity of those perpetrators will result in them being targeted for special measures of oppression and persecution. It's only Muslims who, understandably so, are put into the position where they have to endure these fears. And the reason is that Muslims, American Muslims in particular, know that if the person who commits the crime is Muslim, the penalty won't be borne just by the individual wrongdoers. There will be a collective penalty for the community as a whole. And the reason that's so significant is that is as pure and profound a violation of what's supposed to be the core guarantee of American freedom, that you are treated based on your own individual acts and not punished for your membership in a religious, ethnic, or racial group. And then finally, the reason I think that this last week is so significant is that as soon as the identity of the perpetrators was disclosed and it was revealed that, at least to some extent, they identify as Muslims, although the motive that drove them to engage in these acts, if they in fact did it, is still completely unknown, the assumption was immediately made that Islam must be the core motivating force. And as a result, what we see is what we've seen over the last 11 or 12 years, but even more potently than ever before, which is an attempt to seize on the identity, the Muslim identity of the perpetrators, in a way that is never done for perpetrators from any other faith or any other group, and use it to exploit and ratchet up fear, and then to justify further rights abridgment. So before news even broke almost of who these individuals were, you had Peter King running around on every American major network that gives him time saying that we need more surveillance of American Muslim communities. Even when the Obama Justice Department apprehended the youngest of the brothers, the 19-year-old who is now in custody, they immediately announced within an hour of apprehending him that they would suspend the reading of his Miranda rights, which all Americans are taught to understand is a core guarantee of how our justice system works. And this produced almost no backlash because he was Muslim, and so the laws and the rules don't apply. And beyond that, you have politicians running around in public with no shame advocating that this American citizen be declared an enemy combatant and be imprisoned indefinitely without charges of any kind, without access to lawyers, without being able to go into court. Something that has already been done to an American Muslim in this country for 3.5 years named Jose Padilla, and which is being advocated now be done again. And so I think it's important to realize how quickly what we think has sort of dissipated, that all of that can be revived and rejuvenated because it's always lurking at the surface, because it's been ingrained and embedded in the political culture in a way that really serves as an ongoing threat to our core liberties. So I just want to close with a couple of general points about the state of civil liberties and civil rights and constitutional guarantees in the United States. Whenever I think about civil liberties or the Constitution or talk about it, what I always try and do is think about what are the sort of core rights that Americans understand and are taught are the defining rights that shape our political culture, and how are those rights being treated in our current political climate? That, to me, is the question that provides the answer to what is the state of civil liberties or the Constitution in the United States. And if you look at those rights in order to answer that question, I think you find a pretty clear answer. So you can look at the First Amendment, the very First Amendment that guarantees that nobody shall be punished for their speech, that Congress shall make no law abridging free speech, and you can find dozens and dozens of prosecutions of American Muslims over the last decade, increasing numbers over the last 3 to 4 years, based almost exclusively on the expression of political opinions and political statements rather than criminal acts that send people to prison for decades in extremely oppressive conditions, as profound a violation of the First Amendment as you can imagine. Or you look at the Fourth Amendment that guarantees that there shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures without a probable cause search warrant. and compare it to the massive ubiquitous surveillance state that has been erected, particularly for certain communities in the United States, led by the Muslim communities, and you see how fundamentally that guarantee is repudiated, or you look to the Fifth Amendment guarantee that no person shall be deprived of life or liberty without due process of law, and you compare that to the worldwide system of prisons that the United States maintains, where people are put in cages forever without even being charged with, let alone convicted of a crime, or even targeted for assassination, and you see how fundamentally these rights have been disregarded. What you really see are not episodic or isolated breaches of these core guarantees, but systemic and fundamental ones. And I think it's important to keep that truth in mind, that that's the overarching reality of the state of civil liberties, of the effort to uphold the Constitution. And so the last point I just want to spend a little bit of time addressing is what the implication is for allowing those rights to be violated in such a fundamental way for as long as we've allowed them to be violated. Because I think it is obvious that certain harms come from allowing people to be prosecuted for their speech, or to be imprisoned without charges, or for the government to monitor and surveil everything that we do. But some of these implications are a bit more elusive. And I just want to talk about one in particular because I think it pertains to this last week's events as well. And that is the way in which what we consider to be extremism becomes normalized very quickly. If you look back to, say, 11 or 12 years ago in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, when Congress introduced the Patriot Act, this was an incredibly controversial law at the time. There was lots of debate, even in the aftermath, even in the climate that was created by 9/11, over whether the Patriot Act was really such a necessary law, or whether it was too radical of an abandonment of what we think about as American freedom. And as a result, the Patriot Act, when it was enacted, contained a provision that said, unless this is renewed in 4 years, it will expire. And 4 years later, when it came time to renew the Patriot Act, it was renewed with almost no debate. And 5 years later, under a different president, President Obama, with the Democrats in control of Congress, the Patriot Act was renewed by an even greater margin with, again, very little debate. What was radical 12 years ago, the Patriot Act, is now completely normalized. We never talk about the Patriot Act anymore. We never think about it any longer. It has just simply become embedded in our political landscape. And I just want to tell a quick story that really highlighted this dynamic for me and the way that it works in a very visceral way. I spoke at a university a year and a half ago or so in Indiana, and I spoke about the state of civil liberties and 9/11 and the war on terror, and 3 high school students had driven up from Kentucky, drove several hours north to come and hear me speak, and afterwards they came up to me and spoke to me, and they said, you know, you write a lot about, and you spoke tonight about how 9/11 attacks have radically changed our political culture, and there's all these extremist measures that have been introduced in the name of the war on terror. But one of the high school girls in particular, who was 15, and what she said to me has really stayed with me and really shaped how I think about these things in a pretty central way. What she said was, look, what you need to understand is, I'm 15 years old. I was 4 years old at the time of the 9/11 attack. And you write a lot and you talk a lot about the pre-9/11 world and how things have so radically changed and become more extremist and our rights are under attack in the post-9/11 world. But she said, but for people my age, there is no such thing as a pre-9/11 world. The post-9/11 world is the totality of their political consciousness. What seems radical or extremist or unusual to those of us who remember what things were like prior to 9/11, to people that age, and increasingly every year that goes by, there are more and more people for whom this is true, that is all they know. None of this is radical. None of it is extremist. It is all normalized and an accepted and unquestioned part of how our political system operates and functions. And this is really one of the primary implications of allowing these abuses to endure for as long as we have, is that they don't even seem to be unusual or out of the ordinary any longer. So the last point I just want to emphasize is the fact that although everything that I just talked about is not overwhelmingly sunny and happy and optimistic, it is really ill-advised to walk away thinking that, wow, this all seems so gloomy. And that's sometimes a danger of events like this. You can congregate and meet and talk about challenges and oppression of rights and anti-Muslim animus and things like we saw the last week, and almost become defeatist about it. Like it all seems so horrific and so difficult that it actually can't be effectively challenged. And the reason I think it's so important not to walk away with that mentality is because there are countless examples in history of all kind, recent history, past history, American history, the history of other countries, that disproves that defeatism is a rational response to these sorts of abuses. You can look to the Arab Spring, in which the world's most deprived populations subverted and challenged and weakened and in some cases defeated the most entrenched tyrannies, to see that's true. Or you can look to American history, where all kinds of groups other than Muslims who have experienced and endured the same types of oppression and discrimination have gathered together and found allies and worked hard and found the right strategies and claimed their liberties and rights and freed themselves of that kind of oppression. I think the one enduring lesson of all history is that any structures that are created by human beings, no matter how formidable or invulnerable they seem, can always be torn down and replaced by other human beings if the right strategies are developed and the right passion summoned and the sufficient will present. And I think it's extremely important to recognize that the way that happens is not by hoping that the state will cease abuses or by hoping that people will come to a sense of justice on their own, but realizing that the responsibility is to demand and claim those rights that have been guaranteed by this Constitution. And the way that happens is by having strong and supported and robust organizations that are fighting and working in order to achieve those goals. And there really is no group more devoted to that goal, more effective at fighting for it than CAIR, which is the reason I think it really deserves your support, and it's the reason I'm so appreciative of coming and speaking tonight. So thank you very much for coming, and thank you very much for listening.